Good evening, everyone, and welcome to BioLit Talk Perspectives on the Gut. I am Francois-Joseph Lapointe. I'm a PhD student in infection biology here at the University of Glasgow, and I will be one of the chairs for this evening. Thank you for joining us today. Nice to see you in person. We have two incredible speakers that have kindly agreed to be here, and we're excited to introduce them shortly. But before we begin, as this is the first event in the Perspectives on the Gut series, I wanted to say a few words of introduction to the event as a whole and to those of you who might be new to BioLit Talks. So BioLit Talks is an interdisciplinary and collaborative project between researchers in the life sciences and the humanities here at the University of Glasgow. Last year, we ran a series focused on infectious diseases. We were discussing biology and literature against the common backdrop. This year, we previously ran a standalone event looking at the role of language in science and literature. And we're now returning with a series that has as its common theme the gut. And in these talks, we invite scientists, literary academics, and artists to discuss a common theme. And by so doing, we exchange perspectives on a common subject. We understand how disciplines communicate with one another, and we hope to rethink some of our understandings. This year, we focused on the gut for a number of reasons. The main one being that it's a really good framework around which to discuss the sciences, the arts, and the humanities. So from a scientific point of view, there are lots of advancements in gut research. It's an incredibly fascinating organ. It covers a huge variety of microorganisms. It influences our health in remarkable ways. And the role of the digestive system in physical health, cognition, and emotion has long been known. And it's being represented in a lot of literary and artistic genres. And these are all themes that we'll be exploring in the weeks to come. This evening in particular, we'll be focusing on the gut microbiome and how it can influence the understanding we have of ourselves. This is all on my end, and I'd now like to introduce Michael Walter, who's co-chairing tonight's event, and who is a doctoral student in field of here at the University of Glasgow.
Yes, thanks, Sophia. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and welcome to everyone online as well. I'd like to let everyone know this is a hybrid event, and it is being recorded and will be broadcast online later. So just to make you aware, if you could please, everyone, both online, make sure you're muted, and in the room, if you can make sure your phones are on silent, that'd be super helpful. Thank you. The way we're going to work this evening is we're going to have a 45-minute conversation here between us on our subject, after which point we'll be inviting questions from the audience, that's both in the room and online. Afterwards, for the people in the room, there'll be refreshments outside, and we can continue the discussion. And for both people at home and and in the room, there'll be a survey, so you could please share your thoughts afterwards. That would be really, really helpful. Now, on to the event itself. With us, as Sophia's already said, we have two wonderful speakers. I'll let them tell you a bit about their research, but just so you know who they are first, on my right, we have Professor Francois-Joseph Lapointe from the University of Montréal. He's an art scientist with PhDs in both evolutionary biology and dance and performance studies. And on my left, I have Dr. Manon Mathias, lecturer in French from the University of Glasgow, who will join me in giving them a very warm welcome. So Manon, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your interest in the guts to start us off, if that's all right.
Yes, it probably sounds quite surprising that someone who's a lecturer in French is working on this topic. I basically work on the novel as a genre and how novels and stories more broadly shape and communicate scientific medical ideas. And I mostly work on the 19th century. So I was looking at a particular novelist called George Sand, and I have a chapter in my book on her that looked at her interest in earth sciences, actually. So I was looking at things like geology and paleontology, and came across this particular thinker from 19th century France who had a theory about how human beings connect with other organisms through the digestive system. And I've lost her. Yeah, and that got me into this whole area, and I kept finding references in novels from this period to the digestive system as a way of thinking about our identity as human beings. So I'm now writing a book mainly on the relationship between the gut and the brain in this period in French literature.
Perfect. Thank you. That's super interesting. Francois, perhaps you could share a little bit about your research into
my art or my science?
both, please.
Okay, so
and the intersection between the two.
I do have a dual background. No, I don't have a dual background. I have a background in science, first and foremost. And then I got bored and I did a second PhD in dance, but that has nothing to do with microbiome. So I'm interested in microbiome mostly because of the science we're doing in my lab. So we're looking at the diversity, not only of the gut microbiome, but all sorts of different microbiomes, because you know that we live in a sea of microbes. They live on us, around us, and inside of us. And basically, the first study we did was with a midwife working with me. She's doing a PhD right now, and she's interested in the transmission of microbes at birth from mothers to babies. So of course, we're not only looking at the gut microbiome, we're looking at the vaginal microbiome, the skin microbiome, and everything that colonizes the baby after birth. And I was interested in this aspect of how giving birth and transmitting microbes also transmit not only genes, but transmits bacteria and transmit part of the mother's identity as well. And as an artist, I'm working with these topics. How are we microbes, Homo sapiens, Homo bacterians? Can we live without them? And I'll tell you more a little bit later.
Perfect, thank you. I mean, I think that's one of the most interesting things. I actually remember quite recently I read a study that said most households have a dominant person when it comes to the microbiome of the house.
Yeah.
Is that something you've read?
It's a dog. The dog is the person. Yes. If you have a pet at home, some studies have shown that if you have a pet at home, then the microbiome of of those living with pet are more similar than if you don't have a pet at home, because we spend more time petting the dog than playing with our kids. And the dog is a good vector, or cats as well are very good vectors of bacteria. So if you have a cat or a dog at home, then you're more likely to have a similar microbiome to your other people living with you.
It's really interesting to me because it sort of breaks down this idea that we kind of have of this hierarchy of nature, or the hierarchy of the body, where we have, you know, humans, and within humans, the brain at the top of this hierarchy, and that very much speaks against it. I wonder how that fits in like these traditional understandings. Does it jar in what you found in literature when you researched gut microbiomes and things? Was it something that was generally challenging to society, this understanding of how we're affected by them?
Well, so there have been two different things here. So the idea that the brain is kind of superior organ, as it were, it's not the case that was assumed, you know, throughout history, and it's only recently that that's been kind of undermined. So what I show in my work is that there was a deep understanding of the fact that the digestive system within humans is linked with the mind, and there are lots of different models which we can maybe talk about later to explain how they communicate with each other. So I think this idea that this is completely groundbreaking novel work that challenges this idea of self is not necessarily the case, and where selfhood resides wasn't necessarily in the brain. So to give you an example, in 18th century French medicine, based in the Montréal School of Medicine, there's vitalist tradition, which is to do with trying to communicate a sort of total science of man, which means humans, you know, that's the term used at the time, to explain connections between the la vie morale, which doesn't just mean ethics, like morality, but sort of emotional life and spiritual life. So the connection between that and your bodily processes. And within that, the epigastric region was seen as the seat of the passions, as they were called there, what we would now think as the emotions. So that was just one example of this kind of interconnected model. Then the question about humans being the kind of dominant species, that was beginning to be undermined with obviously bacteriology and the findings of Pasteur and Koch. That was a particular understanding of bacteria as something that can cause disease, which is obviously a negative understanding. But even in the late 19th century, early 20th century, scientists became aware of the fact that there are bacteria that reside within the human gut already, and that they are necessary for human health. And you see this in the second half of the 19th century, studies by people working with infants, for example, and then psychiatrists who were very interested in the impact that certain forms of treatment for digestive disorders influence their psychiatric patients' mental health. So we're talking kind of 1890s here. So it's, you know, it's much older than people realize. So that those sorts of developments led to an undermining already of this idea that humans are separate from other organisms.
Right, that's really interesting, and I think it's easy for us to think that with science we're sort of at the pinnacle of our understanding, and that everything we think now is the best version possible, whereas some of the understandings have been around for a long time. I'm wondering, has this been already reflected in bioartists and art scientists from the 19th century onwards?
Not really. Not really, because if you go back, not in literature, but in science, if you go back to Darwin, Darwin knew nothing about bacteria, almost nothing. And so he was writing a book from a Eurocentric point of view, an anthropocentric point of view. Now we say eukaryocentric. Well, the world is divided between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. We are eukaryotes, and the bacteria and all the microbes are prokaryotes. And so you know nothing about the prokaryotes. So of course, human species was on top of the ladder of a being, and all the others. Bacteria were not even mentioned in this. And now we have to switch from an anthropocentric or eukaryocentric point of view to a microbe-centric point of view, because if bacteria are not there, we die, basically. And so in art, it was not there, certainly because in science it was not there. So it was much later when artists in the 20th century started to use microscope and petri dishes, then microbes became a creative substance.
And what are, for example, the first examples of this?
Probably the first example was using microscopy. Van der Weyck, who invited the microscope, did these small drawings, and so maybe that was the first artistic representation of what a bacteria would look like.
Yeah. No, I'm curious to ask that because obviously, as you said, scientific advancements can influence artistic productions, but it's very much true for the other way as well.
Yeah.
Can I just add, there's an example that a French author called Reside in the late 19th century is engaging with painting of an artist called Odilon Houdon, and the kind of black and white lithographs, and this is post 1860, so I think there's a difference between the late 19th century and the earlier. There's a huge difference.
Yeah.
And then here you have these strange half human, half plant beings, and then there are these little organisms flying around. So there's a kind of suggestion there of bacteria inspired fantasies that then feed into Huysmans' writing in the 1880s and 90s. So that's a quite nice example, I think. And critics have argued that Pégon is kind of showing the anatomy of science, and that's really disturbing. But that's not how I see Huysmans' engagement with that.
I think one of the interesting things about this generally is that decision, that position, whether you see this as something, one thing that often comes into it is this like idea that it's fear of colonization or being colonized by the other, and that feeds into this idea of a self-other dichotomy. And one of the things that's interesting about this biome is that it cuts through that, because of one of the common ways of identifying the self or discussing the self, let's say, is sentience or sapience. But actually, of course, the microbiome can affect what we think and how we feel. So what implications does that have, and how does that reveal itself in art and literature, really?
Yeah, even in some of the metaphors that have been used with respect to the microbiome. Are we an ecosystem? Are we a network? Are we, some people say, a holobiome, which is a more complex form of saying a symbiome between two species collaborating together. Like in lichen, you have like mushroom and algae. So we're a symbiome with thousands of species cohabiting with us. So even in science, people don't agree about what is the right metaphor. So I'm sure that in literature, it's a total nightmare. Or maybe not. Maybe it's a dream come true.
Yes, I think yeah, it's potentially quite problematic. I think some of the terms that I use that are taken from climate science, because that's a very well established field, whereas microbiome studies is at such an early stage that if you import terms from another field, those terms don't come, to you in a neutral form. They come laden with certain, implications, and there's this tendency to be quite utopian and romanticize sort of non-traditional, non-Western, earlier forms of living that was kind of balance, ecosystem, everything was as it was supposed to be, and this has been kind of disrupted by modern living, which is partially true, but I think, yeah, we need to be careful not to idealize the past as well. So that was something I was thinking about when those kind of terms are used. They're sort of taken from other fields, and we have to be careful about that.
Yeah, and some of these terms are simply trying to change and shift the point of view. Instead of having like a top-down point of view, be like more horizontal.
Yes.
Because if we look at the scale of living, man on top, if you look at the more horizontal point of view, the network usually in the ecosystem is more. So each and every species is important. We're not the most important one in this network. And so if there's a disbalance or dysbiosis, we say with microbiome, if we get rid of one of these species, or if a new one comes in, then it may affect the whole system.
Would you say that in a way we could kind of think as the gut then and the microbiome as being sort of our superior or largest or governing organ in our body, or is that too much of a radical position?
I'll let you answer that.
I've never been asked that before, because I guess there is this, I think I always think about dangers in these ways of thinking. If we obsess too much about how what we do influences our individual microbiome, that everyone has this kind of unique, which is the case, we know that, then that places all of the responsibility on the individual as well. And there's this sense that you have to sort of take control and shape it in a certain way. But even when I'm saying that, I'm realizing I'm still thinking of like the self as not the microbiome, which is it's difficult to kind of escape from that bind. But I think it goes beyond any idea of one being superior over the other. That's the whole point, is that they are in constant interaction with each other. I don't want to use the term crossed over conversation, because I think that's imposing linguistic frameworks onto this relationship. But so I think I would be quite resistant to view it in that sense, and think of it more as a sort of something that is symbiotic and constantly evolving as well. So you can't really think of it as this one stable entity. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I would also say it's dangerous, because we moved from the era of genomics, where we believe that our genes could explain everything. And if we can track the right gene, or maybe do some gene editing, there are some tools now which you can do some gene editing that it will solve all the world's problem. Now it's microbiome research. You can do everything with microbiome. Alzheimer's disease, oh, it's the microbiome. You have depression, it's the microbiome. You're a criminal, it's because you have a bad microbiome. The danger is that we don't want to replace genomics as the only answer to one fits all to the microbiome. So we're still in this era when there's the hype and the danger and things we know, things we don't know. And so I'm trying not to be too enthusiastic about what we can do with the microbiome. There's many things that we can do, because we can hack our microbiome, and this is what I do as an artist. I hack my microbiome to change my identity, but it's impossible to get rid of all the bacteria and become someone else. You cannot hack your genome unless you go to Fukushima. Then you would be in big trouble. But you can change your microbiome just by changing your diet.
And I think that's I really like what you said before about the microbiome constantly evolving, and the fact that you've mentioned changing your identity, but changing your microbiome, because actually this idea that we have this huge variety of microorganisms within ourselves that sort of influences us makes me think, well, we're not really that much in control. And so I am wondering now, without getting too existential, but how does the sort of this idea, this fact that we're constantly evolving, and there's something inside us that changes based on our diet, based on our environment, based on pollution, based on where we are geographically, how does it influence our self-identity? How does it do so in literature, and how does it do so in people who are interested in scientific community?
You have some examples in literature.
So how does this, sorry, it was a really long question.
It was experimental before it, but sort of this this idea that our identity is changeable.
Yes. So I think initially, so there are two different ways of looking at it. I think you were kind of hinting at this earlier. I think it depends on your starting point, how you're going to approach it. Because on the one hand, this understanding that certain forms of bacteria could be protective and beneficial, which was known by scientists in the kind of 1890s and became known to the wider public in the kind of 1910s, 1920s. There's a lot of excitement about probiotics at that time, which is not known at the moment. But that was obviously very exciting and quite attractive, and it goes against this idea that bacteria only cause disease, so actually that they can be beneficial. Okay, right. But on the other hand, there's this realization, maybe that was already there on some level, that we are not bounded selves, and we're not kind of separate units, and we are intermingled with other organisms. So there was already, I mean, I know what you're saying about Darwin, but there was already some kind of attack on the idea that we're separate because people became aware of the fact that we're connected to animals, we came from animals. But this went even further, and you see this in the late 19th century literature. This author I've already mentioned, Huysmans, who shows a particular attraction to these sorts of questions. And I think you said earlier something about kind of alluring but unnerving at the same time, and that's exactly what you see in Huysmans' writing. So he often talks about being sort of invaded from within, but he's interested in questions of people kind of being taken over by spirits. So he talks about it in kind of demonology kind of terms on the one hand. Then from a medical background, he talks about hysteria, but then at the same time, he uses words like germe, and which can mean like the germ of an idea, like so he uses it in that sense, but he's just been talking about little organisms, so you've still got that in your mind. And then he uses words like larve, which can mean spirits, but then also means larva. So this is one of the things that literature can do. It can give you these terms that mean both and at the same time. And so it's very kind of uncomfortable, and there's this sense of being invaded by these little organisms. He doesn't talk directly about bacteria, but the way he discusses it, I think, shows an awareness of a particular mechanism of disease called auto-intoxication, which we can maybe talk about later. So there's that. At the same time, he's very kind of interested and excited about it as well, because the descriptions of these little organisms use terms like throbbing, pulsating, fermenting, an adjective like brilliant and phosphorescent. So it's very dynamic, and so it's kind of fascinating, but kind of uncomfortable at the same time. And I think that's a lot. That explains a lot of why we are so interested in the microbiome. I think because we're kind of unnerved by it, because it kind of attacks the idea of a human self. But it means that we are alive. So, and that's what you see in some of the more recent examples as well that I've been looking at in 20th and 21st century writing, with the digestive system is often a way of exploring our animal selves, the fact that we are animals. And there are, like in Emily Nuttum, the best-selling contemporary French writer, there's this constant image of the tube, the idea that we are tubes. And this has been read as a kind of sexual term, but I think it's to do with the digestive system, because she specifically mentions the digestive system and the digestive tube, and that we are just kind of conduits and things pass through. But then at the same time, it says what you see in this tube, c'est la vie. It's life, and it's a kind of form of life. So there's a really long answer. It's a kind of, there's a constant duality, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, that was a good example, because she's obsessed by, what's the word in English, pourriture?
Yes, exactly. Yes, rotting, decomposition.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
That's the decomposition process
Yes.
is because of bacteria.
Yes.
So
Yes.
She's upset by
Yes,
eating American food.
yes, yes.
What was the question?
The question was the change in this idea of identity and how it could be
Yeah,
giving us a bit of a crisis.
okay, so first, can refer to some work we did with philosophers. So we wrote a paper called, which was entitled "Being Human is a Gut Feeling," which in fact has to do with the millions of bacteria that live with us. So it changes everything if you look at the history of the self in philosophy. And of course, let's not talk about the neuroscience and the conscience and everything that has to do with it. Like this famous article, what is it like to be a bat? We can add the conscience, Thomas Nagel wrote this, and so we're working on a paper, how is it like to be a bacteria? Because maybe we can relate to a bat. It's a mammal, it has similar senses besides echolocation, but there's nothing that we can relate to bacteria. So how is it like to be a bacteria? And how are these bacteria are affecting us, being part of us? And so as a scientist, I'm working with philosophers on this aspect, but as an artist, there's a lot of bio artists who are taking bacteria and microbiome research as a new way of representing the self and trying to change who they are simply by collecting bacteria on different parts of their body and letting grow in petri dishes and showing that, see, the petri dishes are evolving, so we are evolving with them. There's an interesting a group of artists from Slovenia who are making music with bacteria collected from the three members of this artistic group, and they have like wires that send electrical messages through these petri dishes, and throughout the exhibition, in the course of a couple of months, then bacteria change, and so the electrical impedance and connectivity changes, so it changes the music. So who's the artist of this artwork? The bacteria, the artist, are they collaborating with each other? I think it's an interesting artwork because it shows that bacteria are part of us, but they can also collaborate with us to create some artistic products.
I also think it's very comforting to think that we have sort of evolved around the bacteria rather than them having to be forced to come over.
It is very comforting.
I think it's also interesting that as part of this like general flattening out that we're seeing with like metaphors and frameworks that are being like applied from outside of the sciences, so from the arts and from literature. Because I was thinking when you were talking, I was also thinking about another philosophical school. I was thinking about the speculative realists, and I think it's Ian Bocost's I think it's alien phenomenology, or what it's like to be a thing. And there's even this line of thought that is questioning that also traces back to Alfred North Whitehead in the 19th century, in this idea of like lively matter. And there's this general sense that we are more than an agential object, that we are also things, and this flattening is interesting. But what my question is, and what I've gotten thinking about is how important interdisciplinarity is in order to discover these metaphors and these ways of thinking that give us access to this stuff. Because quite often it's never ahistorical, as you say. We're thinking networks, we're thinking ecosystems now. So this dialogue, I wonder what the value of this dialogue is between subjects to access this stuff.
I guess that's why we're here. It's here today. It's crucial because we're working with philosophers now. I look at my science in a different way. Working with artists, then I look at my philosophical colleagues in a different way. I work now with people from law school who look at bacterial fingerprints as a way to solve criminal cases. So it changes so if we go from identity to identification, it's a totally different ballgame. So can we move from fingerprints to DNA fingerprints to bacterial fingerprints? Bacterial fingerprints are changing all the time. Your fingerprints and maybe DNA fingerprints are not changing, but it changes all the time. So is this part of your identity? So if it's part of my identity, then you can identify me on a crime scene using this. And so it changes everything. By talking to different colleagues in different fields, then it opens up new field of research for me as well.
I don't know if you've had, if that was, I don't know how that affected research in the 19th century, for example, because I don't know how different interdisciplinarity looked then.
Well, I was going to say, so to really understand what novelists are writing about, it's inherent in the culture, because the boundaries between science, medicine, literary writing, gastronomy, they were completely permeable compared to today. So, you know, Flaubert, Zola, Balzac, Dickens, you know, they were reading about this sort of work. They understood it, and it was much more accessible. They were reading about it in sort of general, you know, journals. And so if you're working in that kind of period, I think you have to be interested in the connections between these different spheres. But even today, when we think of disciplines as being so specific and having, you know, their own kind of vocabulary, I think there is still value to be found in working, you know, with, because the microbiome, you know, it is inherently interdisciplinary. Even within the sciences, you have to have input from all different sciences to really understand it, because there are so many different pathways connecting different parts of the body and beyond. But with what the arts can bring in, from my perspective, anyway, the literary contribution here is that I think because it's at such an early stage and it's such an incredibly complex field, on the one hand, if you want to write a scientific paper explaining how you know, a particular sort of bacterial behavior on behalf of the individual might influence host health long term, you know, okay, might need to write that very, very direct, clear language. But if you want to write a different sort of paper that thinks about the consequences of this in terms of questions of selfhood, or what it might feel like for an individual suffering from a particular gut disorder to experience that very close interaction between the gut and the brain, or a paper on how we change lay people, non-specialists' understanding of the microbiome, then literary language opens up new avenues of possibility, because what literature can do is that it can kind of push us further in terms of, we think that there's a boundary of what can be communicated and what can be articulated. Literature enables us to push beyond those boundaries through symbols. I think that's one of the key things that literature can do, is that it can mean something and it can mean something else at the same time. So it can you know, it can use a term, like I was thinking about an example recently, like décomposer, and so it meant breaking something down, but it also had that meaning of rotting in there within at the same time. Or there was a passage about the skin being passed over, and the verb was transverser, so it meant that kind of the sun was kind of passing over the skin, but transverser can mean to penetrate. So, and I was talking about, and that was a complete human interaction. So I think that's quite difficult to convey in a visual form, because someone is being crushed or they're not. Whereas in literature, you know, you can have the metaphorical meaning and you can have the literal meaning at the same time. And then what you were saying about what is it to be a thing, and can we imagine what it might be like to be bacteria? I think literary forms can do that, and they can kind of enact what we now know, which is that alimentary matter, food, actually shapes us. Because in a novel, like in Zola's novels, vegetables can come to life. They can be the subject of a verb, and they can give birth, and they can have stomachs and hearts. And this is kind of language that is used, that they can sort of do things like ferment and transform and agitate. And we know that the vegetables are not literally alive and are not literally pushing their stomachs out, suction of pumpkin and Zola. But by saying that, the author is challenging the idea that we humans are the only ones that can act. So, so I think that that's one of the things that literature can do, is to kind of enable us to imagine other possibilities.
Sure. You can never write that in a scientific paper.
Exactly. Yes.
You have to be precise. You got to use the right verbs. You got to be people have to be able to repeat this experiment.
Yeah.
So I was giving this example today that so one of the experiments that I'm doing is the 1,000 handshakes. So I go in different parts of the world and I shake hands with 1,000 persons to create artworks. but I'm also publishing scientific papers using exactly the same data. Well, I can say whatever I want in artwork. I can produce whatever I want. It's a different way of conveying the same message to a different public. If I publish a paper in microbiome journal, you're not, maybe you're all scientists, but my mother will never read it. But my mother comes to an art gallery and she sees a nice picture and says, what's that? Well, that's my hand microbiome after 665 handshake. And then we have a discussion about microbiome afterwards. Not because she read that and she said, oh yeah, line 32, you said that use 16S technology, 116S.
Yeah.
That's not important for her.
Manon, you mentioned the need to like adapt language, and you mentioned the role of art in science outreach. What is sort of the role of realistic representations in this artistic science outreach, and what is the role instead of imaginative representations in science outreach? And how can you sort of coincide?
I've changed my mind over that because being trained as a scientist, the first artistic project that I did, I wanted to be very precise, rigorous. If I had like 10,000 sequences, I wanted to have like 10,000 sequences represented in my digital images. And then I realized that that's not important. What's important is that I'm not trying to convince people that this is true. I'm not talking to their brain, I'm talking to their gut. I'm talking to their emotions. So it's a totally different thing to do art and to do science and to do literature, because you can add metaphors, you can add analogies, you can add just a little tiny bit of reality, but it opens up new doors, which is impossible to do in science because it has, well, it will never be published because reviewers will say, okay, you don't have enough details here or there. This is not true. Other people have done it, and they falsify your work. How can you falsify a novel? How can you falsify an artwork? Maybe people will say it's not good, but they can never say it's not true.
Well, one of the interesting things for me, the way you're talking, is it just highlights the kind of siloed nature of academia, where you say, you know, what's done in art and what's done in science and what's done in literature, and here it's done this way, and here it's done that way, when actually what you described was how they was to me illustrated a kind of liminal space between them all, which illustrates the holistic entirety, right? It's not like science, the science paper, you know, it speaks to scientists and can be used obviously and have value as data, but at the same time to understand it. And when we say we talk about for another audience as if scientists are not also people, right? They're also the people who are going to be using this, who are going to need to have an embodied, a gut understanding of this thing in order to locate its meaning in the world, right? So what do you guys think about the way universities are structured to handle this sort of situation?
Okay, are we? Don't start me on this because I'm having a hard time. Not now, but when I started to do art and science stuff, well, your colleagues are telling you that what you do is nonsense. When I apply for an Arts Council grant, I need to hide that I'm a scientist because I get bad grades. And the opposite, when I'm submitting a grant proposal to Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council in Canada, NSERC, well, no, don't say that you're doing art because you will never get that grant. So I have two CVs. I'm the same person. And my artistic, well, I don't believe that we have two sides of the brain, but my artistic self, which is a whole, is influencing my scientific self. And it goes in both ways. So universities are working with barriers between different, you have med school here. If you have a med school, that's even worse because med school is on top and then everything else is below. I also have a med school in my university, so I know how it is. And then you try to propose an experiment that you want to do for art, and you go to the ethics committee, and then they go ballistic. So yeah, Leonardo da Vinci was a good model. And we have to go back to this. And although there are a lot, like this is an example, there are a lot of experiments out there of interdisciplinary collaboration. But once you get the money, then it goes to this department and this other department. So money runs the show. And this is the problem.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've had a very positive experience in Glasgow in that there is a sort of a very encouraging environment. And this is one example that has been funded from various sources, including the most of the school.
Yep.
And there is a move towards greater disciplinarity, which is what this building is built for. So I think that's very encouraging, but there are still issues. I agree with the funding, and it has to sit somewhere, and then that person then becomes, in control. There's also publication issues, and I've just written a paper with some psychology, which will get published, and it's been rejected by a particular journal because it didn't fit that journal. So we're trying to find another journal that's going to be more open to this very kind of open approach. So there are still certain barriers. Sure.
Yeah, and still it's a publication. Researchers know what a publication is. I have on my CV publications and exhibitions. And so how can you measure up if you have like, I don't know, 10 papers published in such and such journal with impact factors that maybe, I don't know, 60, 70, 80% will read, and have like this exhibition with thousands of people coming. How can you compare? So it's very difficult. Publications, even in different fields, they're different.
Yes.
But if you compare publication to non-publication outcome of research, then it's impossible.
One thing that struck me while we were both speaking is that even literature and art that I'm used to thinking is a lot more sort of subjects that have less rules instead seem to have a lot of them for you to have a different CV that doesn't talk about science to apply for histograms. So I'm wondering sort of what are the rules that exist in these two fields, how they can they be compared to scientific ones, and how can they possibly be sort of used or changed to break down the barriers that we just discussed?
Well, it seems that everything we said today was trying to break that top-down vertical relationship, man and everything else, med school and everything else, science and everything else. I'm trying in my own collaborative process to work horizontally, to be like microbiome as a metaphor, like a network, but it's very difficult within the university system. And it's very difficult to try to take a set of rules from one field and apply it, transfer it to a different field, because the research objects are not the same, the research methodology is not the same, the research outcome is not the same, exhibition versus publication, the discourse is not the same. Sometimes you were talking about language, the same words mean something totally different. So it's kind of difficult to sit in between two chairs. And I see my position sometimes as a scientist, sometimes as an artist, so I can switch that. But most of the time as someone who translates the discourse of X into Y. So if I'm in a company of artists, engineers, designers, scientists, and one person is saying something, and I need to rephrase it so that my colleague understands. And well, it's like being bilingual.
Yeah.
I'm bicultural because there's a culture of science and the culture of art.
Yeah, I think what you said there was really important that you're explaining it for someone else. So I think the audience is key here. Who's your audience? Who are you writing for? That will determine how you approach it and what your objective is. So one of the things I found difficult when writing this paper I just talked about is that my style was very, seemed to be the person very discursive, and I would look at particular quotations. I would have lots of quotations and I would analyze them and I would look at the style. And then my colleague's style was more just sort of fact, citation. It was just so different, and I had to be very, very tight with my writing. So there was a difference in style as well, which is, yeah, something. So I was just thinking, okay, who am I writing for here? What sort of journal is this addressing? And if it's going to be mostly people in the sciences, then I'm going to have to change my style slightly. If we're writing mostly for, food historians, then that person's going to have to change their style slightly. But I think there are still different styles. And there isn't this kind of utopian style yet that just works for everyone.
It's not a unique style.
Yeah.
If you can play that game, go to a PhD defense in literature and go to a PhD defense in biology. It's entirely different. In literature, you have someone sitting in front, reading a document, no image whatsoever. In biology, you need to have data, method, results, and a lot of figures, and there will be a lot of explanation. Then comes the question, period. All members of the jury in literature and humanities, they would talk about themselves for like 5 or 10 minutes. Well, this is what I understood about what you did, but you use this perspective. I would be using a different perspective. Members of the jury in science pieces, they have that, okay, lane 15, page 62, 16S once again. Why have you used 16S and not 18S? And so it seems that it shifts the importance of the candidate as opposed to the jury. It's really, really interesting. I actually went there and was using a chronometer, saying, okay, this is your PhD defense. You're supposed to be on stage talking most of the time. The jury talks most of the time in literature and humanities and social sciences. And so the cultures are different. You have sets of rules that people know or don't know, but that's why it's impossible to say, okay, the universal rule that in physics, because physics is always on top. It's not med school, it's physics. And that's why we all have physics envy. You cannot use physics in literature, you cannot use physics in humanities, you cannot use physics in art. And the opposite would also be impossible. It's a bit depressing today. No, I'm just saying that it's very difficult to change this hierarchical structure. Very, very difficult.
Do you think some of that comes from the way that social structure imitates this like historical understanding of what we are and of ourselves? And do you think that the understanding of the microbiome has the potential to change that?
Well, certainly as a field, that's the whole essence of it, is that it's a more kind of horizontal approach to human beings. Whether that's actually feeding into practice yet, I don't think so. Within day-to-day medical care, for example, the mental and bodily health are seen as separate and are treated in very separate ways. And if you go to a mental health institution, do they focus on this person's exposure to sunlight and fresh air and types of exercise and diet? Not really. And then if you just had a procedure like surgery, your emotional well-being, your spiritual well-being doesn't really come into it, and the kind of entanglements between the two, they're very, very separate. And things like, if you go on antibiotics, is it mentioned that how this might influence the parts of your body? Probably not. So I think it's going to take time for it to have a wider impact in terms of kind of these of flattening out structures. I haven't seen examples of that happening yet in day-to-day medicine. My own experience or other people I've spoken to.
That would be good, but not there yet.
Yeah.
I wonder also, obviously one of the areas we also bring into our conversations is the humanities, which sit in this kind of intersection between arts and sciences. And I think we've mentioned ethics several times today as well. And do you think that this is an arena that can start to facilitate the shift from, both the artistic and the scientific perspective into the social and the institutional?
Ethics. Okay, you want to start? It's interesting because I'm working with an academia. So I've dealt with ethics committee before when I was doing real science.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm doing art science, it's the same committee, but I know how they work. But as part of research creation chair we have in my department, we're inviting artists from outside academia to work with us. They've never dealt with ethics coming before. And for them, it's a real pain in the ass because it kills creativity. And my job is trying to tell them, okay, you have this box that's an enclosure, and you got to find your freedom inside that box. Instead of thinking outside the box and say, oh, I can do whatever I want, it's art. Maybe you could have done whatever you want before coming within the university. And we have sets of rules. Say if you're working with other persons, you need their consent. If you're working with animals, well, you don't need their consent, but there's a list of things you can't do to animals. If you're working with bacteria, you can do whatever you want, unless they're pathogens. And there will be a biohazard for you. If you're working with plants, then there are limits.
We've talked a lot about the advantages of a sort of cross-disciplinary discussion. I am wondering, particularly referring to the gut microbiome, I'm interested in what you mentioned before about criminals and using the bacterial fingerprint. Could there be cases in which an interdisciplinary discussion can bring more risks than benefits? For example, in the case that you mentioned, or before you were talking about language and metaphors, could they maybe bring to a lay audience a distorted idea, perhaps?
That would go totally against my belief. So
Yeah, yes. Because of what I just said, that every word has, no word is completely neutral, and in different languages, different words will have different histories, different flavors, there'll be different kind of subsets of meaning within that word, and it'll carry with it certain associations, negative perceptions, cultural beliefs, and there'll be values around it. So the words that we use, I think, can potentially be dangerous, yes. And I think that's what I was hinting towards when I was talking about this dramatization of a sort of stable state microbiome that people used to have in the past. And so yes, people could be sort of influenced in a certain way by the language that is used in a discussion. So I agree, having to put something through an ethics committee is very, very labor intensive and time consuming, but I think it is fundamentally aimed at protecting the people who are participating in the research and forcing you to think through all of the potential things that might happen. So it does sort of inhibit you in a certain way, because you can't just go completely off course, and you have to think about the individuals in the room and how they might be influenced by what's happening. But this question of risk, I suppose it could lead to a sense of panic as well in certain people. I think that this idea that we should be living a certain way that goes against our entire lifestyle, and that kind of trapped in this way of living at the moment, and that sense of blame, especially for certain people who are more vulnerable. So those are the things that kind of immediately come to mind for me, at least. I think the potential benefits outweigh the risks, as long as you go through this process of putting it through an exaltation, thinking about who is involved in this research, and how might it shift their perceptions or harm them potentially. I think it kind of safeguards it to a certain extent. So I think, yeah, the benefits of it.
One of the things that I was sort of touching on when I was talking about maybe ethics was the wrong thing to move to, because of its
Yes,
like, exactly. So like irresponsibly use the word to illustrate to everyone here your point.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Ethics, yeah.
Because we have these disciplines that we can instigate these discussions with, that potentially can change the institutions and reframe how we examine these things, and that might be an interesting place to talk about the interdisciplinarity above and beyond the kind of more extreme silos we're talking about today of science, arts, and literature. That could be an interesting one. I think before we bring up a new topic, I might have to wrap us up, because if we're going to need to bring in audience questions, But before I did, was there anything else you wanted to mention before we moved on to audience questions, or that I didn't touch on?
One of the questions that you mentioned before we haven't had the chance to talk about is what other organs within the body might be interesting to look at, and I was interested what you thought about that as well. Beyond the gut microbiome, and I guess you're going to say kind of the skin and the vaginal microbiome.
Yeah, well, talking about risks, there's the big pressure nowadays on women who give birth through C-section to actually repair or restore the natural microbiome that they were passed on to their babies. And I know that in some countries, like in Canada and France, where I've been working, it's allowed. I checked, but in the UK, it's kind of difficult to actually have this on your birth plan because there's no mandatory testing for strep B. And therefore, if there's this additional medical act of actually, well, what is the vaginal seeding is if the baby is born by C-section, the doctor would put a sterile cloth in the mother's vagina and wipe the baby's mouth and face afterwards to transmit the vaginal bacteria. But by doing so, may transmit pathogens that the baby would pick up naturally, but it would not be the doctor's fault. So it's all about insurance, of course, and money once again. But in France, they do it. It's compulsory to actually have a strep B test and so they know if you need antibiotics or not in the UK. So this becomes risky in some countries and not others, and it was not like that 10 years ago when nobody knew about the microbiome transplant and so on and so forth. And so yes, knowing more can be riskier than knowing less, for sure. And the more we know about microbiome, more people are trying to do some at home microbiome fecal transplant. People do it at home. You have Crohn's disease, okay, I'm going to try to repair it. This is very dangerous.
I think there's also the emotional risk involved in telling a woman who's had to have a cesarean section in order to be alive and for her child to be alive. Oh, by the way, you've just given your child birth potentially, which might be, there are recent studies that show that the child is born by cesarean vaginal delivery. But long-term health of the child, there aren't any studies on that yet. So we just have to be careful about framing it very carefully, and that it's not sort of, there are sort of emotions that might be involved in all this as well, and emotional risks.
Great, thank you. That was a great one to add in. Thank you for reminding us, Manon. So now we can take questions from the room and also online. I believe we have someone posting the questions online for us. So if anyone's thought of questions, firstly, perhaps we'll look to the room. Anyone has a question, please raise your hand. Do we have a mic roving? Yeah. So just give us a sec for the mic. Thanks for your patience. Yeah.
So I actually have so many questions, but I'll try and make it one. With the way we live nowadays, how we're destroying our microbiome, we're sterilizing everything, we're all popped up on antibiotics and living in plastic rooms basically. Do you think, how do you think that affects the microbiome interplays with our collective psychology, collective psyche, and then how does that impact art, the way we view the world and the way we talk about the world? If we're becoming more aware of it, the more disconnected we're getting from it. So we're basically saying, oh, there is no self-other, it's all one, but at the same time as doing that, we're disconnecting ourselves. So it's I don't know what the thought was on that with your art practice.
It's a tough question. Of course, the Western world microbiome is not in good shape, but not by saying that, oh, I have a good microbiome, I have a bad microbiome, and this is risky to put the pressure on people that You need to eat more kombucha, and drink more kombucha, and eat kimchi and fermented food and probiotics. Otherwise, your microbiome will not be good, and you'll be a bad person. I don't think that this is that's the message. We know for sure that in some cultures they have a more diverse microbiome. So the microbiome is like the Amazonian forest. The more diversity, the better it is in terms of stability, in terms of resilience. So monoculture, a corn monoculture, if it's in big trouble if there's a pathogen that comes in. The same thing with the microbiome. If a pathogen comes in, all the other good guys can probably fight it. And so we know that. We know that if we go back in history, and some people have tried to restore the previous microbiome by going to hunter-gatherers cultures in Africa. That's not the point. We live with the microbiome that we have nowadays. But by bringing this message across, I think that it will get better because people are trying to improving their diet. People know that for 2 years we've been using these bacterial soap, and I'm more interested in the skin microbiome than the gut microbiome because the skin microbiome is the envelope, the relationship we have with others. We don't really exchange a gut microbiome, but we exchange skin microbiome every day with everyone. And so the message is that it's part of us. The Western world is really affecting it. And I think it will bring like a collective knowledge that we have to take care of our microbiome, not only take care of the planet, because we were discussing this before. After eco-anxiety, will there be microbiome anxiety? We don't want to create microbiome anxiety by being here today saying that there's a good and a bad microbiome. But just by knowing this, then people will, I think, react in a positive way. By doing, like for the saving the planet, doing some small little things that may help your microbiome.
I think there was the second part of that question was interesting too, which is like, are there ways in your art practice that's reflecting that change or exploring that change somehow from this mentality?
Well, what my art practice tries to do is to do some performative experiments that are actually changing my microbiome and see what it was before, what it was after. So I would go to a city and eat something that I've never had before. I would collect my fecal microbiome before and after, and I would do like these two images. That was me before eating kimchi. That's me after eating kimchi. It has nothing to do with kimchi. It has the way it has to do with saying to people, what you're eating is changing your microbiome, and therefore it's changing you. So that's one way for me of trying to convey the message.
Do you have any other questions? We have one here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Just listening quickly. Thanks for the discussion. First of all, it was very interesting to listen to it. Maybe slightly related to what was asked already, but I would be curious to hear maybe your personal accounts of changes that both of you have undergone that have to do with diet or doing something to change your microbiome. That can be the microbiome or skin microbiome, and whether you can draw from examples in science or in literature. And I can just give a personal example. When I started eating plant-based, I definitely started thinking about myself as someone else. So I really like the fact that you talked about changing your microbiome being a way to change your identity. I definitely think of myself as a different person now than I was 7 years ago or so. And I sometimes wonder whether we are succeeding in tracing these changes, for example, in science. I'm a scientist myself as well. For example, I don't think there's that many studies that are longitudinally following people who have been eating meat and then, for example, transition to a plant-based diet and how that affects their microbiome. So I'll be curious to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
So just thinking about the paper I was just talking about with the psychologist, that was looking at whether an awareness of the gut-brain environment connection, interaction, shapes people's behavior. That was what we're trying to look at. So I was looking at examples from the past, and then my colleague was looking at examples from today. And it's quite difficult to trace. And what we started to find that there was awareness of it, but not necessarily deep understanding. And there were differences to gender, religious beliefs. It was really interesting, but it's a very early stage of that project. So there are some indications of people moving towards different behaviours because of this new scientific development. So plant-based diets was one of the main things that we were looking at, but also how often do you walk outside and gardening and all these sorts of things that means that you have increased interaction with different microbes. Having done this sort of work, I reduced my meat intake definitely, and I was pregnant and 3 years ago, and I was thinking a lot about who I was as a human being. I had another human being inside me, and I was thinking about interaction between the womb and the digestive system, and that was I don't think there's much at all on that relationship, because your digestive system changes completely when you're pregnant because it's just completely squashed. There's no space for it at all, so it operates in a very different way. So that was a very an experience that made me think about the way that what I was eating was influencing me, because it was influencing the child as well. And then breastfeeding made me think very differently about the microbiome as well, and what I was eating was then being transformed into something that was then going to feed someone else's microbes and not just me. So those are some of my personal experiences that have come out of this research, I suppose.
I've stopped using antibacterial gel.
Yes.
I don't want to kill my microbes.
Yeah.
So soap is good. This is the first thing that comes to mind, because I'm working mostly with the skin microbiome. That was a long question, so I was trying to
just simple examples. Can be something personal that you feel changed you as a person.
Yeah. Okay.
That
So
affected you.
since I'm not a psychologist nor a social scientist, like in the paper that you wrote that was rejected, you probably surveyed a lot of people.
Yeah.
I'm doing self-experimentation, so I don't document how I feel before, how I feel after. I'm producing data art, and people are looking at the difference. So it's not important for me to convince them that I was this before and now I'm someone else. I know that I'm someone else, although I don't have to actually write a paper about it. I know that most of the work that I'm doing right now is influenced. I'm not doing the same science that I did before, because I've been working with philosophers telling me about what is it to be human now. So it changed not the person that I am, but it changed the focus of my scientific research through art.
Which is also partly that's sort of the interesting thing about that, is that like we've somehow separated the discussion of what is you again. In that you felt the need to separate which parts are actually you. So really interesting question to keep me framing that one.
We've been brainwashed to think about
really have. It's so hard to break.
Yeah.
Like even us who like have
The critical brain, the artistic brain.
Any other thoughts or questions? Thank you for that. Yeah, the one next to actually ask that.
Yeah, so I have a follow-up question with the gut and brain axis. So I recently read a blog about yogurt. It's a happy food, and it has immediate effects on our mood when you're not in a good mood. So it immediately changes our mood. So I'm curious how true it is, like how well it works.
Yogurt.
Yeah, and the unsweetened yogurt.
Well, I mean, I'm not a scientist, obviously, and it's not like you need to like immediately this huge sheet. But if you want to look at historical examples, that there was an understanding that the lactic acid, which is the good thing in the yogurt, could influence a person's physiological health, but also their state of mind. In the late 19th century and then very beginning of the 20th century, there were lots of projects commercializing lactic acid, and there were kind of dairy products that were sold that you could take orally in a form of a pill. And there are adverts for these in particularly in French and American general and medical journals and kind of general newspapers as well, 1910s, 20s, 30s, that shows you that show kind of protective, they call them strains of bacteria, and then they both use like close-ups of bacteria, and they say these are good bacteria. So this is over 100 years, well, about around 100 years ago that this was already happening. There's been a boom in probiotics research, and it was being commercialized as well. And some of the images that are used in the adverts are quite interesting. There was one example I found in the 1920s, I think, of police officers kind of rushing around and saying these bacteria are police officers for your gut. So it goes back a long way, and yeah, there was an understanding then that lactic acid. So that's an example that I would give.
So two different answers to your question. The first one is that probiotic yogurt, there's been conflicting results in scientific studies about the real benefit of it, because there's not enough bacteria in just one or two strains of bacteria. The microbiome is so diverse that they work in collaboration. So some papers say it's good, others are saying it has no impact whatsoever with respect to the diversity. But I have a funny story to tell about yogurt. So I read a couple of years ago that paper based on animal models. It was probably mice, showing that feeding them probiotics increased the sperm count. I said, that's interesting. I'm going to do performance doing this. So I'm going to be eating yogurt. You see where I'm going. Ethics committee rejected the project. That's my personal story with yogurt.
Thank you. Any more questions? I've got one right at the back. We'll just face the back. I'd like to as well.
Maybe a very personal question. How do you combine your research and your artist world? Are you like 50-50% hired? Like, how can I one day maybe have like this combination, and yeah, like do funders accept that as like I'm an artist 20% and
okay. So several years ago, I wrote a paper. I can, if you come afterwards and have a drink with me, I'll send you the reference, which was entitled, I don't remember if it was how to become or how I became an art scientist. And I have a set of rules that you need to respect to be a real art scientist. One is symmetry, the other one is synchronicity. Symmetry is that it has to be more or less 50-50, otherwise it's a hobby. And it has to be synchronous, meaning simultaneous. Not, I was an artist, I quit my job, now I'm a scientist. So it had to be done at the same time and more or less in a similar fashion. It took me 20 years to be able to do it. So it's difficult. Funding bodies are reluctant to finance such projects, but we're lucky in Canada to have interdisciplinary programs that are available for projects that are called research creation. And now I get most of my funding to do research creation. I would say 60 to 70% of my funding is to do research creation. Well, also because I don't write science proposal any longer because it's boring to me. After writing up 150 papers, what's the difference between the next one you're going to write? So it's much more exciting for me to do research creation. But I'm still in part of the biology department. I'm not hired as a joint faculty between art. We don't have an art department in our university because there's a med school. So there's a med school. There's no art. It's recorded. Yes. But it takes a lot of time. But it's possible. It's actually possible to do both. And with research creation funding, now it's easier for me to tell my colleagues that I need more time to go to art conferences and to do exhibitions and only science conferences and publications. Because as usual, money runs the show. If you bring in new money, then they say it's good.
I believe you have one more question there, and then perhaps we can check in online, see if there's anything.
Hi. So basically, I have two questions, so we can answer it both of them. So my first question is that previously, as we have seen, there was this time when there were no antibiotics, and there was this revolution that these are the antibiotics, and now they can treat every disease or anything like that. But in current scenario, as we can see that there is a global threat of antimicrobial resistance. And particularly when we look at it in terms of the gut health, so we are seeing that in everything, like if you have any mental disease, mental like kind of health issues, it's again related to gut-brain axis. So we are connecting to gut in so many things, like in terms of your good health, in terms of your disease, each and everything is now somehow related to your gut or diet. So do you think that we are transitioning into the era where we are seeing a dietary revolution? And my second question is that in terms of publications that we have seen that in case of microbiome, the articles that we usually write or we publish, so how can we make it more kind of interesting? Because if you do like any kind of statistical analysis, that's too boring. Like you have to make box plots or each and everything. This like how the art can help over here that you can make these papers more interesting. Like there is a trend now that we are submitting graphical abstract, so it makes it an interesting story out of the paper. But like I'm just curious that how art plays role over here in terms of improving the publications rather than those boring statistical figures. How can we improve that? Thank you.
So, oh yes, I don't know if I'm very well placed to answer it, but the question about whether we're moving into a new era, I think there's this perception that okay, the gut-brain axis is like everywhere now and everyone knows about it, but only in certain spheres. As I was saying, I don't think it's translated into everyday practice in terms of how people live and how people are cared for. So I don't think we've got to that stage on that question. That's my feeling here. And the second question about how to make science papers more exciting.
Well, I'll also give a little bit more of the first question. I think that we're slowly moving to the era of psychobiotics. So replacing antibiotics with probiotics to maybe cure some brain conditions, brain diseases, but we're not there yet. The second question is quite interesting because there's a danger. We were talking about risk before. There's a danger of using art as a PR machine for science. So, we're bringing an artist in, it will improve our productivity and the publication will be better. This is not a single artist wants to do it. It's like instrumentalization of art. You have graphical designers who can do it for you, but art is not that. Art is not to improve the science and the publication. Art as its own world. It's the art world is quite something very different from the scientific publication. And the graphical abstract is graphical abstract now that the many publications are requiring is quite interesting, but you don't need an artist to actually do it. You need someone from your lab or a student who actually knows and understand what you're doing. So when I have to do a graphical abstract, although I do art, I'm asking usually my daughter or my wife, what is the take-home message of what I'm trying to explain, to convey the message, and say, okay, you did this, and then this is for me the framework for the graphical abstract. But it doesn't have to be interesting in terms of art. It has to be in terms of communication. For me, it's more like a PR strategy rather than art.
Hello, yes, so obesity is a major health problem nowadays. To what extent do you think that the microbiome actually influences one's weight and therefore health? And how can we tackle this problem?
So many studies have shown the relationship between the microbiome and obesity. How to solve the problem? I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a diet expert.
Yes, because I know that we're moving away from the dogma that one size fits all, and that this is also applicable for diets as well, as far as I know.
But that, I guess, Carrie, yeah, I think that's kind of helpful because we know that that's not true, that one approach will suit everyone because everyone has genes and different microbes respond differently to medication and all these different things. But at the same time, there is the risk then of placing all the responsibility on the individual and their feelings of guilt and shame and blame involved in that as well. So I think you need both. You need to kind of this individualized approach, but also the understanding that every individual exists and operates and functions within a much broader system of food production, and we're surrounded by certain forms of food. So you need both the individual and the system to change.
And as we're moving towards personalized medicine, I think we will have to take into account not only our genome, our culture, the environment, but also the bacteria that live within us. And some treatment may work on me and not on the person sitting next to me, although we may live in the same city, eat the same food. And so this, I think, will come into the picture. Going back to obesity as a multifactorial problem.
Yeah, we have a question online.
So I have two related points from the online chat, both regarding the phrases trust your gut and gut feeling. So Dora asks, regarding the trust your gut and gut feeling, is it possible to define it and quantify it? And then Louise is sort of following up saying, I'm also interested in historical origins of those phrases, gut feeling and trusting your gut, if you know anything about that.
I would just say that the idea of gut feeling, it exists because of this very long tradition of knowing that the gut is involved in aspects of one's life beyond the breakdown of food. And there was even before we knew of the microbiome, there was this intuitive appreciation of the connection between gut and emotions. So I think that explains the gut feeling, and then the gut instinct, or to trust your gut, is the sense that you're just, well, that's to do with making decisions often, and that decision making is not just located in the brain, that cognition interacts with your digestive system as well. So yeah, there are different models to it that was explained in different periods of history, but yeah, there's a reason that they're there. Don't know if you want to say that's
So I don't know why, when this saying started out.
Yeah, no, I don't know either when exactly it's going.
But for sure, the metaphor of your gut being your second brain has been there for a long time. I don't really like it. It serves a different function. For sure, we know that there are lots of neurotransmitters in your gut, just like in your brain, but it's not your brain. So people are sometimes using bad metaphors. So it's like it's a secondary brain or a secondary organ that replaces the brain or looks after the brain. No, it does something totally different. First of all, digesting your food.
The secondary question that was part of that, which might actually lead to potentially a reframing, was can you quantify that influence, or what a gut feeling might be and how it's impacting you? I don't know what you think about that.
How would you quantify that? This is a question for psychologists, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying not to quantify anything I do with respect to art, because I've done, I don't know who was talking about statistics. I'm trained as a biostatistician. So numbers, I'm fed up with numbers. I like colors now. And I know that colors can have numbers, you can find by numbers, but you don't need to quantify everything to be true.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions or nothing online? Anyone else in the room before we wrap up? One more, two more. We've got one right in the middle here.
I guess you've mentioned a couple of times as sort of a danger in disseminating microbiome information. Do you have ideas about how to avoid a moralizing model of the microbiome, and does interdisciplinary work have a role in that?
Just to go first, big one. That's the big one.
That's a very kind of more research. I think more research will be helpful, because that's one of the problems, isn't it? That it's such an early stage, and then people can kind of jump to conclusions too quickly, and they can become overhyped. So more research is one thing, and avoiding kind of oversimplistic explanation, having some kind of control over the narrative, which is very difficult. But in terms of interdisciplinarity, I suppose getting more people from different disciplines involved, because then the understanding is going to be richer and could disseminate through different channels.
It's true for microbiome research, but it's true also for AI.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's like an exponential growth, and it's like the magical solution to everything. And eventually it will either crash or reach a plateau. I don't think it will crash. I hope AI will crash, but but I think it will reach a plateau, and we will not look at microbiome research as a solution to all the world's problems: obesity, C-section, antibiotic resistance, food hunger. And that's for me what the danger is to see in the microbiome the solution to everything, and to see that as in a solutionist standpoint is very risky, because people will be, what's the word in English? Disappointed. See, I'm losing my. People will be disappointed because the expectations are there. We will cure Alzheimer's disease by eating yogurt. It's not true.
No, caveat,
Yeah.
not true. I should say we've run out of time, but we will, for those in the room, have time to chat afterwards. So I think we can wrap up there.
Yeah, before we close off, there's some people I'd like to thank, obviously. First of all, a small reminder of the questionnaires. For those of you that didn't have one on your chair, if you could please complete it over the next 3 minutes. First and foremost, thank you to the speakers, Francois and Manon, for making it all the way here. It's been great to have you with us tonight. A really interesting conversation. You provided plenty of insights and knowledge, and really enjoyed your event. Francois has not only come all the way across the Atlantic for the Biologist Talks event, but he was also kind enough to host a seminar today at the School of Infection Arrangement. And Manon not only acted as a speaker tonight, but she's also had the mentoring and advisory role in the whole setup of the second series of Biologists. So thank you very much for both of you. A big thank you goes to our funding bodies, the College of Medical, Veterinary and Life Sciences, for kindly awarding us the Public Engagement with Research Fund. In particular, thank you to Alice Calcott and Susanne Bendu. I would also like to thank the Glasgow Medical Humanities Network for awarding us the Early Career Award, in particular Gavin Miller and Kristen Sard. A big thank you goes to the Art Public Engagement team for allowing us to host the events in the venue, Charcoal have a space for and having interdisciplinary discussions. And of course, a thank you goes to the other members of the Biologist Talks team, not only Michael Wood for co-chairing tonight's event, but also Amy Bowie, Fiorita, and Rachel Lewis, who will have a chance to talk to you soon. And of course, thank you to all of you who joined us this morning, whether in person or online. Hope to see you at the next event, and please join me in thanking all of the people I mentioned.